Are non-random election checks undermining voter trust? An Alabama audit law sparks red flags. Hello, I'm John Mounts, and this is Viewpoint Alabama on the Alabama Radio Network. Joining me now to talk about this is James Dickson. He's the founder of the Make Politics Local Again movement and the host of the James Dickson podcast and a former New York Post swing state reporter. James, welcome to Viewpoint.
Hey, good morning. Thank you for having me.
James, before we dig into this law, Alabama has stepped into the political spotlight this week with the possibility of redistricting. In fact, it's almost certain we're going to have some redistricting. What are your thoughts on the Voting Rights Act and the Supreme Court's recent decision sending districting back to the states, specifically the state of Alabama?
Yeah, we just saw a big change with the Voting Rights Act, where based on a case out of Louisiana, the last thing preventing a state like Alabama from representing, how many Republicans are truly there has been removed. And so now there's this effort, and you match that with the redistricting that they're doing in Virginia that they tried to do, going from a 5-6 split Democrat-Republican to a 10-1 split Democrat-Republican. And two things have just happened. One, people see the Democrats and what their mindset is. And two, the Supreme Court says there's nothing stopping you from redistricting yourself.
James, what is the difference between, or is there a difference, between a black district and a Democrat district?
I think there is a difference. We saw this in Michigan where I live. So we had citizen redistricting, so-called citizen redistricting, and the map it produced in 2022 allowed Mallory McMorrow, who's now running for the U.S. Senate seat. That district was engineered so that a white Democrat would hold it. More of the black Detroit votes were moved out of it. Suburban white votes were moved into it. And so the real race that year was between two Democrats, and it was decided by the cut of the district, which favors a white Democrat as opposed to a city black Democrat.
And you look, for example, at Memphis, where the district is represented currently by a Democrat who happens to be white. They've redone the district now to where they've kind of cut Memphis into three little areas, and they said that this will be more fair and it will result in better representation. But critics say, well, but we're not going to have our Democrat to represent the district. And they say, well, it wasn't, and they say this is hurting black people, but the person who's representing the district is a white guy. He's a Jewish white man who's definitely a Democrat. But that's the reason why I'm wondering how much of this really is about voting rights and equal representation of people, with the same skin color, and how much of it is just Democrats remaining in power.
John, that's a great point because, again, the same dynamic in Michigan. Congressman Sri Thanadar, right? He represents the seat in Congress that John Conyers used to. And so this was from the 60s to the 2010s, late 2010s, John Conyers represented this district in Detroit, the John Conyers seat, right? It was like black representation before that was widespread. And so then he resigns and dies, and ever since then it's been held by Sri Thanadar, who is absolutely not any of those things, but he is a Democrat. And so I think the Democrats themselves are having to wrestle with this. Do you need a black Democrat, or is a Democrat just enough? And when it comes to holding power, I find that the color that matters most to the Democrats is blue.
I thought you were going to say green. Money.
Yeah, it's blue. So they don't really care which flavor of Democrat. As long as you vote reliably for the agenda, representation doesn't matter as much as we've been told.
Here in Alabama, we've got 7 congressional districts. The poorest district by far is the 7th, and that was the original, now we have 2, but the original majority-minority district. It's the poorest one, and it seems Terry Sewell didn't just get there. She's been there for many, many terms, and before her, it was Earl Hilliard. We've had a bunch of people representing the black populace of the state, and it's been the poorest district. So it seems like these people have not been able to effectively help their constituents, but yet they continue to remain in power. Why do you think that is?
Well, it's just like Maxine Waters, right? Didn't she brag for the longest about how she represents the poorest district in America? And so rather than black representation being some kind of tide that lifts all ships, what it does is it lifts one person into the American elite. And the idea, people laugh at trickle-down economics. What they really get is trickle-down representation. with the idea, because there's a Maxine Waters, because there's a John Conyers, your community doesn't need anything because someone who looks like them is represented. I mean, what you just said about Joe Biden, I find so fascinating because our governor, Gretchen Whitmer, she put on the full court press trying to get that VP spot and was looking like it might be her. She did everything she could to be a star in 2020. Then George Floyd dies. Then this metric is added where it's not just a woman and not just the best woman, but it has to be the blackest woman Joe Biden could find. And there was only like 3 of them to choose from, and so it became Kamala Harris. George Floyd dying literally changed the course of American history.
And yet George Floyd had nothing to do with, like George Floyd himself didn't set out to do that. It's just something, it almost seemed like it was weaponized to be used to affect that election. There was like they were looking for an event that happened, and George Floyd fit the bill well enough. White officer, black black guy was breaking the law, and there's no question he was breaking the law that day.
Right.
And the arrest went bad, and that's all of a sudden it became the seminal moment to this is going to be the ground on which we're going to plant the flag. And that became the whole switchover politically. It's amazing how such a small event like that, relatively speaking, can drive such a huge change in politics in America.
You know, and I think, John, that's why we've become so PSYOP resistant as a people, because 2020 was the year of the PSYOP. So this was all happening during COVID. I know you guys didn't get it as bad, but the COVID regime in Michigan lasted like 2 years before kids were regularly all back in school. And so these turning points of history where they said you couldn't go outside, but if you're protesting George Floyd, you could go outside. And we just swallowed it all up. We just ate it all up. Very few people pushed back. I was one of them, and it was not appreciated at the time. But now everybody says they were fighting those battles.
Well, and these battles that it seems we continue to fight, they reverberate over and over again. We're looking down the road at the midterm election coming up in November, and there's a possibility of power shifting. And if that happens, you can bet that the Trump administration, a lot of the things they're trying to do, the legs will be cut out from under it, because if we have a Democrat majority, which does often happen in the off-year elections, a Democrat majority takes control of Congress, you can imagine the first thing they're going to do is start impeaching, and Donald Trump might have things he wants to do in the next 2 years, but he's not going to be able to accomplish them for the sake of all the constant lawfare that he's going to face.
Well, I mean, you look at these first 2 years, what has he really been able to accomplish with Congress? And so I think it's been probably the biggest disappointment where Trump comes in, does all these executive orders. I mean, look, the president runs the country. They have all the federal employees are under the president, so there is quite a bit you can do. But when it comes to something like the Save America Act, really the only thing Congress has done for Trump is the one big beautiful bill. There hasn't been a second big beautiful bill, and so what you have is like Congress is built to not do anything, but it would be helpful. Do nothing is a lot better than actively trying to stop you.
This is Viewpoint Alabama on the Alabama Radio Network. My name is John Mounts. I'm speaking with James Dickson, the founder of the Make Politics Local Again movement and the host of the James Dickson podcast. James, one of the original reason we had you on was to talk about non-random election checks that are undermining the voter trust. There's an Alabama law that's going to spark some red flags here. Explain what we're talking about when we talk about non-random election checks. Yeah,
so it's this new law in Alabama that basically one precinct has to be fully audited per county, and for every countywide and statewide election, one precinct in each of those, right? Essentially on the bottom level, if these audits all took as quick as they could across 67 counties, we're talking about something that could cost $2.3 million, and it could become much more expensive than that. And the question really driving it is, how much is election security worth it to you? How much is peace of mind that these machines are doing what you told them to do? They're recording the votes you give them and not what they're programmed to do in Venezuela or whatever. How much is that worth it to you? And Alabama sounds like it's worth quite a bit.
In Alabama, we do pride ourselves in having some of the most secure elections, and this has been a long-standing tradition we've had in this state. And there has been back and forth as to whether or not we're going to use paper ballots or machines. There was a time when we actually switched to completely automated these machines, where there was not even a paper record. You poked the things in, and the machine tabulated, and it was all electronic. We've gone back to where we do paper ballots, but we do have the ballots counted by a machine. Is this audit, first of all, who is the person who is going to be doing the audit?
So the audits are going to be done by a probate court judge in each county, which, in Michigan, that sounds a little odd to us, because probate court judge, that decides things like wills and trusts and things like that. We don't necessarily involve them in election matters, but each state's a little different. So I'm fascinated to see how the process will work. I'm fascinated by whether the judges themselves are qualified to do this kind of work, and if anyone will trust their work product. But I think any step toward election security and just making sure that things are what they claim, as opposed to us assuming everyone says our elections are safe and secure, but they never offer any proof. So I think a step toward proof is a good thing.
And James, I realize you might not know this because you're not here in Alabama, but our probate judges are elected, with the exception of if they should, say, resign during their term, then the governor does appoint them. But in Alabama, they are elected usually for a 6-year term. Is that how it is where you are as well?
I got to think that that's an elected position, but each state's a little bit different. I think it would be more of a trusting position if they were elected, as opposed to appointees of the governor, who would then be assumed to be acting on the behest of the governor.
And that's the thing. We want to make sure that if we're going to go through this process, to make sure that there is not any cheating, any underhanded action going on, that those who are checking are absolutely above board. Because if we put people into that position to check that stuff, and they're on the take as well, or they have an agenda, you're going to have again, people are not going to trust the process. And if people don't trust the process, they're going to become disenfranchised, and they won't vote. And if they don't vote, then it defeats the whole process of us even doing the election.
Well, and then it becomes worse, right? Because right now, whether you trust the process or not, the process is not costing you any more money. When this is a minimum $2.3 million and could be tens of millions of dollars, and you don't trust that either, now people are going to get very, from what I understand, Alabama is not a rich state.
No.
Right? So if you're throwing around this kind of money, people need to trust the process that's behind it. And so will they? Do they? Remains to be seen. But I got to think people are relieved to at least see someone talking about this. In Michigan, it's almost a third rail to talk about whether the machines work, when it sounds like that's exactly the kind of thing you'd want to discuss.
Well, what could end up happening is then we'll have to have an auditor we'll have to audit the auditors, right? There'll have to be a
Who will
tertiary
audit the auditors? Yes.
Because you don't know what they're up to. But at the end of the day, I do like the fact that we do vote on pieces of paper. So those pieces of paper go somewhere, and I believe they store them for a period of time so that if they need to go back and recount them. Although, as you saw what happened with the presidential election of 2020 in Fulton County, there was a question as to, we can recount these ballots over and over and over again, and every single time it shows that Joe Biden won. But the question is, are all those ballots legitimate? And then there's not so much the question of the counting of the ballots, but the ballot itself.
Oh, yeah, and we have those questions in Michigan. And so this mantra that decided the 2020 election was called count every vote. And how it played out in Michigan is our Secretary of State puts out this edict to the 1,500 election clerks. We're going to have unprecedented numbers of absentee ballots come in. Presume that those signatures are valid. Now, presume and assume, those are not really government words. The job of any election official is to verify before they certify. But here was the top election official in Michigan saying not to do that. And so that alone casts doubt as to the results that come in. Because when the people who are supposed to find the truth blind their own eyes so they can't see the truth, it's natural to question, why would they do that?
James Dickson, the founder of the Make Politics Local Again movement and the host of the James Dickson podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll definitely have you back because we're not done redrawing those districts here in the state of Alabama,
right,
and then seeing how that's going to play out in terms of we're very close to, next week we've got the election, and then we're going to have to probably have a special election to redo it after the districts are redrawn. So we'll probably have you back again to talk about how this is going to shape up both in our state and nationally.
I would love to, and John, thank you so much for this opportunity.